The five-star restaurant exuded sophistication, its air thick with the aroma of fine cuisine and the soft strains of a classical orchestra playing in the background. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over elegantly dressed patrons, each table set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses. It was a place where people expected perfection, a seamless blend of exclusivity, service, and refinement. Sandra Bullock stepped inside, her presence immediately noticeable, though not for the usual reasons. She wasn't clad in the high-fashion attire that most guests wore to such an establishment. Instead, she had chosen something comfortable: jeans, a soft sweater, and minimal makeup. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was simply who she was. She approached the host's podium, where she was greeted warmly and led to a table in the quieter section of the dining area. As she took her seat, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't the usual attention she received. As a celebrity, this was different. A few patrons exchanged glances, and a particular waiter took notice. The young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, had worked at this restaurant long enough to recognize the elite clientele that frequented it. They arrived in designer suits, with expensive watches glinting under the dim lights. He had learned to anticipate their demands before they even voiced them. But this woman dressed so simply did not fit the mold. With a smirk, he leaned toward a fellow waiter. "Check this out. I'll take this table," he murmured, an amused glint in his eyes. He walked over, standing tall as he approached Sandra's table. His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable condescension beneath it. "Good evening. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Sandra looked up, slightly caught off guard. "I'm sorry?" The waiter chuckled. "It's just that, well, this is one of the more exclusive spots in town. Our menu isn't exactly affordable." He let the words hang, his expression smug. Sandra took a breath, keeping her composure. "I appreciate the concern," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I think I'll manage." The waiter gave a slow nod, his smirk unwavering. Of course. Just making sure. Wouldn't want any surprises when the check arrives." Without another word, he turned and walked away. Sandra let out a quiet sigh, shaking her head. She had encountered moments like this before: assumptions made based on appearance, whispered judgments passed without knowledge. It was exhausting, but she had learned not to let such things ruin her evening. However, someone else had been paying attention. Just a few tables away, Keanu Reeves had been quietly enjoying his meal with a friend. He was not the type to make a scene, nor did he relish unnecessary attention. But the moment the waiter spoke to Sandra in that tone, he noticed the shift in her body language, the subtle sting in her eyes. Keanu wasn't one to tolerate disrespect, especially when it was undeserved. Placing his fork down, he glanced at the waiter as he moved back toward the kitchen, still wearing that smirk. Keanu exhaled slowly, his decision made in an instant. "Excuse me," his voice rang out, calm yet commanding. The waiter stopped, turning around. "Yes, sir? Something wrong with your meal?" Keanu shook his head. "Number. But I'd like a word." The tone caught the waiter slightly off guard, but he kept his cool as he approached. "Of course. What can I do for you?" Keanu didn't raise his voice, but there was an unmistakable weight to his words. "I just watched how you treated that guest over there." He nodded subtly towards Sandra's table. "And I have to ask, do you always judge people before you serve them?" The waiter blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Two was just making conversation," he said, forcing a chuckle. "No offense intended." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't conversation. It was judgment. A few nearby tables had grown quieter, diners subtly tuning into the exchange. The waiter shifted slightly, trying to maintain his composure. "Sir, I didn't mean anything by it." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Then why did you say it?" The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. An unspoken lesson was unfolding before everyone. Sandra, watching the exchange, felt an odd sense of gratitude. She hadn't needed someone to step in, but Keanu had, and he had done so not with anger or raised voices, but with quiet, undeniable authority. The waiter's posture stiffened, his previous arrogance dissipating. Keanu continued, his voice steady. "Everyone who walks into this place deserves to be treated with respect. That's not about money. It's about decency." For the first time that evening, the waiter looked genuinely uncertain. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, but now, standing in front of Keanu Reeves, he felt small, A hush had settled over the room. Conversations had slowed, diners pretending not to listen, but hanging onto every word. The waiter swallowed. 2. Understand. Keanu nodded, finally leaning back. Good. Then, after a pause, he added, next time, let your service speak for itself, not your assumptions. The weight of the words hung in the air as the waiter gave a short nod and turned away. But it was clear to everyone that something had shifted within him. Sandra caught Keanu's gaze, offering a small, appreciative smile. He returned it with a simple nod before picking up his fork again, as if the moment had already passed. But it hadn't. The lesson had been delivered, and the impact would last far beyond that evening. The restaurant gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but the air still held a quiet tension, as though the weight of what had just transpired hadn't yet settled. The waiter, now behind the counter, fidgeted with the hem of his uniform. His hands, which had once carried plates with practiced confidence, felt unsteady. The exchange with Keanu Reeves had struck something deep within him, a realization that he had never quite confronted before. For the first time in his career, he felt truly embarrassed. Not the fleeting kind of embarrassment that came from forgetting an order or spilling a drink, but something far heavier. He had been so sure of himself, assuming he could size someone up in a glance. But Keanu had peeled back that arrogance with just a few calm words. He exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. He wasn't sure how to move forward from this moment. Meanwhile, Sandra took a sip of her water, her fingers lightly tapping against the glass. She wasn't one to let strangers' words affect her deeply, but there was something about the way Keanu had handled the situation that lingered in her mind. She had spent years in the public eye, being scrutinized and judged for everything: her looks, her career choices, even her personal life. She had learned to brush most of it off, but this was different. This wasn't about fame. This was about basic human dignity. She had dealt with subtle slights before whispered assumptions, people questioning whether she belonged in certain spaces. It was a reality she had learned to navigate. But tonight, she had witnessed something she rarely did. Someone stepping in, not to speak for her, but to call out the deeper issue at play. She glanced over at Keanu. He wasn't looking her way. In fact, he had gone back to his meal as though nothing had happened. That was the thing about Keanu. He never sought recognition, never made grand gestures for attention. He did things because they were right, not because he wanted credit. Sandra leaned back in her chair, letting a slow smile creep onto her lips. Across the room, the waiter was still reeling from his own thoughts when the restaurant's manager approached him. "Step into my office," he said quietly. The waiter nodded, following his superior into the small, well-organized back office. The manager closed the door behind them and turned to face him. "Do you know why I called you in here?" The waiter shifted uncomfortably. He hesitated, then sighed. "I messed up." The manager studied him for a moment, arms crossed. "You know, in this business, service is everything. And not just good service, but respectful service. You don't get to decide who belongs in this restaurant. That's not your job." The waiter nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand." The manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're a good worker, but arrogance doesn't belong in hospitality." He paused. "I'm not firing you, but you will be retraining from the ground up." The waiter's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "I'll do better." "See that you do," the manager said before motioning toward the door. "Now, get back out there and show me you've learned something." As the waiter walked back out onto the floor, he felt different. Lighter, somehow, but also more aware. He caught a glimpse of Sandra Bullock, who was still seated, quietly enjoying her meal. He had spoken so carelessly to her, assuming she was beneath the restaurant's status. And yet, despite that, she didn't appear angry or smug. She simply looked at peace. He didn't understand how. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his uniform and made his way over to her table. Sandra looked up as he approached, and for the first time that evening, the cocky smirk was gone from his face. He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier." Sandra tilted her head slightly, considering him. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about you," he continued, his voice quieter than before. "That was wrong and disrespectful." A pause. Then Sandra smiled, not out of pity, but with genuine understanding. "Thank you," she said simply. I appreciate that." The waiter hesitated, as though there was more he wanted to say, but instead, he simply gave a small nod before retreating back to his duties. Across the room, Keanu had seen the exchange. He didn't react, didn't call attention to it, but he allowed himself the faintest of smiles before turning his attention back to his meal. The night carried on. Diners finished their meals, conversations resumed, and the evening unfolded as it always did in such an elegant establishment. But beneath the surface, something had shifted not just for the waiter, but for many who had witnessed the moment. It was a reminder that kindness didn't need to be loud, that standing up for others didn't require grand gestures. Sometimes, the most powerful changes happened in the quiet moments through a simple conversation, a few well-placed words, and a willingness to see beyond the surface. And for Sandra, as she finished the last sip of her drink and prepared to leave, she knew one thing for certain. Tonight had been an evening she wouldn't soon forget. Days passed, but the events of that night remained fresh in the minds of those who had been present. The waiter, once filled with quiet arrogance, found himself re-examining his behavior. At first, he told himself it had just been an off night, just a harmless mistake. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't a one-time thing. How many other guests had he silently judged? How many times had he made someone feel out of place without even realizing it? The lesson Keanu had given him that night echoed in his mind. Let your service speak for itself, not your assumptions. He had replayed those words over and over, letting their meanings sink in. It wasn't just about a job, it was about respect, about treating every person with the same dignity, regardless of what they wore, how they looked, or what they could afford. Something inside him shifted. He started to notice things he hadn't before, how some guests hesitated before ordering the most affordable item on the menu, how others avoided eye contact as if they expected to be judged. He had once overlooked these details, but now they stood out to him. One evening, an elderly couple walked into the restaurant. Their clothes were simple, nothing extravagant. A younger version of himself might have dismissed them as unimportant, but now he saw them differently. He approached them with genuine warmth. "Welcome, it's wonderful to have you here." The couple exchanged surprised glances before smiling. It was a small change, but it meant everything. Meanwhile, Sandra Bullock had carried that night's experience with her as well. It wasn't about the insult. She had dealt with worse. It was about what Keanu had done, how he had stood up for her without making a spectacle, how he had quietly but firmly reminded everyone in that room of something so simple yet so often forgotten: basic human decency. Sandra had always admired Keanu. They had worked together before, and she had long known that he was one of the rare people in Hollywood who remained untouched by arrogance. He treated everyone the same, from co-stars to crew members to waiters at five-star restaurants. But seeing him in action that night had been different. It had reminded her of something important, that people like Keanu weren't rare because of their fame or talent, but because of their character. And it made her think. In the days that followed, she found herself paying closer attention to how people were treated in everyday situations. She noticed the way store clerks were ignored, the way waitstaff were sometimes snapped at, the way people made judgments before even speaking a word. She started speaking up more, not just in big ways, but in small ones. A kind word to a server, a nod of acknowledgement to someone often overlooked. Little things that made people feel seen, because that was what Keanu had done for her. He had reminded her and everyone in that restaurant that kindness was powerful. And then, one evening, fate brought them back to the same place. Sandra walked into the restaurant again, this time with a few friends. The atmosphere was just as refined as before, the soft hum of classical music floating through the air. But something felt different. The waiter spotted her almost immediately. He hesitated for just a moment before making a decision. This time, he approached with a warm, genuine smile. "Miss Bullock," he said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance it once had. "It's a pleasure to have you back." Sandra raised an eyebrow, amused by the shift in his demeanor. "You've changed." The waiter chuckled softly, nodding. "I'd like to think so." Sandra could see it in his eyes. She meant it. "Good," she said simply before taking her seat. As the night went on, she observed the way he worked. He was different, no more patient, more thoughtful. He no longer sized up guests the moment they walked in. He served with care, treating every customer with the same level of respect, regardless of who they were. It wasn't a forced change. It was real. And then, just when she thought the evening couldn't come full circle any further, Keanu walked in. The waiter noticed him right away. And unlike before, there was no smugness in his expression, no silent judgment. Instead, he approached with the same respect he had shown Sandra. "Good evening, sir," he said sincerely. "Welcome back." Keanu met his gaze, immediately recognizing the shift in him. He gave a small nod of approval. "Good to see you again." The waiter felt an odd sense of pride, not because he was being acknowledged by a celebrity, but because he had earned that nod. He had learned something that night, something far greater than just how to be a better waiter. Keanu took his seat, and Sandra couldn't help but glance over at him. When their eyes met, she smiled. "Seems like you're making a habit of changing lives in this place," she teased. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "Not changing lives, just reminding people of what they already know." Sandra tilted her head. "Not everyone knows it." Keanu thought for a moment before shrugging. "Then I guess it's up to us to remind them." Sandra smiled again, sipping her drink. Keanu was right. It wasn't about making grand statements. It was about the small moments, the quiet lessons, the little things that added up to something bigger. And as the evening continued, Sandra realized something else. Sometimes, all it took was one moment, one word, one act of kindness. Because in the end, it wasn't about how much money you had, how famous you were, or what you wore. It was about the simple truth that Keanu had reminded everyone of that night. Respect should never be earned. It should be given freely. To everyone. Always. Weeks had passed since that fateful evening, but the lesson Keanu had imparted continued to ripple through the waiter's life. At first, he thought it was just a one-time realization, something he would remember, but eventually move past. But the more he reflected, the more he realized just how much his attitude had shaped his experiences, not only at work, but in life. One evening, as he set down a tray of wine glasses, he overheard a conversation between two guests. They spoke in hushed voices, but he caught enough to understand. "Felt so uncomfortable. Like I wasn't supposed to be here," a woman admitted to her friend. The waiter stiffened. That "feel like you don't belong" was something he had once made people feel. His stomach churned. That night, as he closed up the restaurant, he found himself standing outside in the cool night air, watching the world move around him. He had spent so long believing that his job was simply about serving, about memorizing orders, presenting plates, and refilling glasses. But now, he saw it differently. It was about people. The way they walked in, unsure of whether they'd be welcomed. The way they hesitated before making a request, afraid of being judged. The way a small moment of kindness or cruelty could shape their entire experience. Keanu had shown him that. Not through a lecture, not by yelling, but by demonstrating what it meant to see someone beyond their appearance. The waiter exhaled, stuffing his hands into his pockets. He wasn't the same person who had judged Sandra Bullock that night. And he didn't want to be. The next day, he approached the restaurant manager. "Sir," he began hesitantly, "I wanted to ask if I could take on more responsibility. Maybe help train the newer staff?" The manager raised an eyebrow. "Training?" "Yes." The waiter nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about how we treat guests, Joe. I used to treat guests. I want to make sure no one else makes the mistakes I did." The manager studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. Let's see what you've got." It was a small step, but it was the beginning of something greater. Meanwhile, Sandra Bullock had found herself thinking about that night more often than she expected. Not just because of the insult. Not just because Keanu had stepped in, but because of what it represented. In Hollywood, she was used to people treating her differently, sometimes putting her on a pedestal, sometimes underestimating her. Either way, it was exhausting. But that night, Keanu had reminded her of something important. She had a voice, and she planned to use it. A week later, she was invited to speak at a charity event supporting young women in the film industry. As she stood before the audience, she thought back to that evening in the restaurant, the way the waiter had judged her, and the way Keanu had turned the moment into something powerful. She adjusted the microphone and smiled. "You know," she began, "people often think respect is something you have to earn, that you have to prove yourself worthy of being treated with kindness. But the truth is, respect isn't a privilege. It's a right. It should be given freely to everyone." As the audience listened, Sandra felt something shift inside her. She had always been strong, but now she felt empowered. Keanu's quiet act of standing up for her had sparked something inside her, something that would continue long after that evening had faded into memory. As the months passed, the impact of that night at the restaurant continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The waiter, once blinded by his own assumptions, had become a completely different person. Not only had he taken on a mentorship role for the new hires, but he had also changed the way he interacted with guests. He listened more, he paid attention, and most importantly, he treated every single person with the same level of warmth and respect whether they were wearing a designer suit or a simple pair of jeans. One evening, as he was clearing a table, the restaurant doors swung open, and in walked a woman who immediately caught his attention. Sandra Bullock. This time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a close friend, her laughter light as she spoke. She looked around the room, seemingly enjoying the ambiance. But when her eyes met the waiter's, there was a flicker of recognition. She raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The waiter straightened his posture and made his way over to her table, heart-hammering slightly. "Miss Bullock," he said smoothly, but with none of the arrogance he once had. Instead, there was genuine humility in his tone. "It's great to see you again." Sandra smirked. "You remembered me." The waiter chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Hard to forget a lesson that changed my life." Her expression softened. "Have things been different for you since then?" He nodded. "Very much so. I didn't realize how much I had to learn until someone called me out on it." He paused before adding, "And I appreciate it." Sandra studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Growth looks good on you." The waiter smiled, something lighter in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt proud not of his job title, but of the person he was becoming. A familiar face. Later that night, as Sandra enjoyed her meal, she found herself glancing toward the entrance, just as another familiar face stepped inside. Keanu Reeves. She chuckled under her breath. Of course. Keanu had a way of appearing just when he was least expected. He moved through life without fanfare, without seeking the spotlight yet somehow. His presence always made an impact. The waiter noticed him as well, but this time, instead of hesitating, he walked over with quiet confidence. "Mr. Reeves," he greeted, nodding respectfully. "It's a pleasure to have you back." Keanu looked up at him, recognition flickering in his dark eyes. He gave a small nod. "Good to see you again?" Sandra, observing the exchange from her table, couldn't help but smile. The last time they had all been here together, the energy had been different, tense, heavy with unspoken judgments. But now, there was something lighter in the air. Keanu took his seat, and as the waiter left to bring his drink, Sandra leaned over with a teasing glint in her eyes. "You know, I think you might have a secret superpower," she said. Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? You don't just play heroes on screen," she said. "You make them." Keanu chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't think I did anything special." Sandra tilted her head. "Maybe not to you, but to him?" She gestured subtly toward the waiter, who was now moving between tables with a quiet grace. "You changed his life." Keanu was silent for a moment, watching as the waiter interacted with guests no longer with arrogance, but with genuine care. Finally, he exhaled and gave Sandra a small, knowing smile. "I didn't change his life," he said simply. "I just reminded him of who he could be." Sandra sat back, thoughtful. Maybe that was the secret to Keanu Reeves. He didn't try to be a hero. He didn't try to change people, but simply by being himself, by standing up for what was right, he made people want to be better. And in the end, that was the greatest impact of all.